So, when you picture Jesus, what does he look like? Do these paintings look familiar to anyone? I hope so. They're some of the most popular paintings of the 19th or the 20th century. You may not know the name of the painter, Warren Solman, but his work was by far more popular and reproduced many more times than any other artist of the 20th century. And I want to be as sensitive as possible because I know there are a lot of emotions wrapped up in our reactions to paintings like these. But this also is not what Jesus looked like. These pictures have a history, and a fairly recent history. Warren Solman, in 1924, was an illustrator and commercial artist and was commissioned to come up with a cover for a youth magazine for the Covenant Church and came up with a charcoal version of the head of Christ, which is the painting on the right. Now, that drawing itself became very popular and reproduced many more times until 1940 when he painted the color version. From church bulletins to calendars and posters and bookmarks and prayer cards, tracts and buttons and stickers and stationery. I even found clocks and lamps that appeared in many churches and homes. It was reproduced over 1 billion times with a B. This picture went viral before that was even a thing. Now, some have speculated that these pictures, both the head of Christ and then Christ at Heart's Door, became popular because they represented Jesus as inviting and welcoming and accessible and reassuring, and also not exactly bound to a time or a place. And these inevitably helped shape our and many people's faith and our relationship with Jesus. I also think there's another reason they became so popular, and it's because they produced a popular version of Jesus as white. And for the record, Jesus was not white. He was a Middle Eastern Jew. Now, Salman, who was definitely not the first artist to render Jesus in the ethnicity of the dominant culture, and was by far not the first person to render Jesus as white. Both of these pictures are in a long tradition of Jesus looking basically like this. But the popularity of these images kind of helped ingrain in myself and many of us, whether consciously or not, whether we wanted it or not, a sense of a white Jesus walking around the Middle East in the first century. So, but why does it matter? Presumably and hopefully this isn't new news to most of you, and we all know at some level that Jesus wasn't white. But why is it so important? Well, thinking of Jesus, how we think of Jesus shapes how we relate to Jesus, and even how we see others relating to Jesus. Thinking of Jesus or even God as white is dangerous and probably even a form of idolatry as we fit God into a smaller box than God can fit in. And thinking of Jesus leads those of us who are white to think that we may be the gatekeepers for any and all non-white people. And throughout history, this has been a dangerous idea. Now, Amy Jo Levine is a New Testament scholar whose work emphasizes that we can better understand Jesus if we appreciate his Jewishness. She reminds us that Jesus of Nazareth dressed like a Jew, prayed like a Jew, instructed other Jews on how to best live according to the commandments given by God to Moses. He taught like a Jew, argued like a Jew with other Jews, and died like thousands of other Jews on a Roman cross. So if we don't understand and appreciate Jesus' Jewishness, we don't really understand Jesus. Now, I don't normally quote a lot of academics and theologians to you all, because you don't know them. But Dr. Jo Levine is an interesting one. She's a New Testament scholar, but she's also a person of Orthodox Jewish faith and heritage. She also teaches at Vanderbilt and helps, among other things, prepare future pastors for Christian churches. And she argues, among many other points, that taking the Jewish context of Jesus as seriously as possible is not just the right thing to do, but brings new life and relevance to the stories that we tell so often, we wonder if we're wearing them out. She reminds us that uncovering the context often means uncovering the shocking language of the stories we've become familiar with. So in this Lenten sermon series, Conversations of the Heart, the aim of today was to speak to conversations with other cultures. So why start with the Jewishness of Jesus? Because if we approach Jesus as white, and by we, I mean people who are white, we approach Jesus as one of our own. We assume a level of familiarity and accessibility that isn't quite there. And we too easily remove Jesus, the physical body of Jesus, from the time and the place that he came to. And we see any non-white person's approach to Jesus as something that crosses racial and ethnic barriers that we don't imagine for ourselves. In short, imagining Jesus as white imagines a false sense of privilege, and that's not in the gospel. Now, the story that we heard for today of the Canaanite woman and her faith is a hard story to hear. It may be one of the most upsetting and the most shocking and sometimes one of the most difficult texts to preach. And preachers and readers struggle with it. And I don't like to just tell you what to think, but a lot of interpreters just get it wrong. Now, it's hard to hear Jesus refuse to heal a woman's daughter because she isn't one of the lost sheep of Israel. It doesn't make sense with the Jesus that we know, and so it's hard to make sense of what's going on here. I think it's a hard story to hear because at some level we don't want to listen to what it's trying to tell us, even if it is ultimately good news. So this story is hard to work with. It's often pointed to as one point in which Jesus makes a mistake, or at least the human, non-divine side of Jesus makes a mistake. Jesus at first denies the woman, which is wrong of him, but the woman corrects him and he changes his mind. And I think the willingness to accept that interpretation says more about us than about Jesus. It says a lot because we're willing to accept a farther-fetched, impossible, dare I say heretical interpretation because it's easier to hear than what's actually going on. Now, I don't want to tell you how to think for yourself theologically. That's not what we as a church are about or what the UCC is about. But at a very basic level, if you can separate human Jesus from divine Jesus, you run into some problems pretty quickly. And if Jesus can make mistake, what are we really saying about God and the divinity of God? So it's hard to hear that Jesus might have actually meant to say what he said, and that we might actually have to listen to them and sit with them for a minute. Jesus came only for the lost sheep of Israel. Jesus is Jewish and lived and walked among other Jews. He celebrated Jewish holidays and traditions. He taught Jewish teachings, and even if he took a new or took a particular side or offered a particular perspective, it was always still within a Jewish tradition of interpretation. Jesus lived out the call that was given to Israel. He was the one for the many, the good shepherd for the lost sheep. We know who Jesus is because of his relationship to Israel and Israel's relationship to God. Now, The Canaanite woman didn't ultimately receive grace and the healing she was seeking for her daughter because she corrected Jesus, because she corrected a mistake, or just because she was persistent, or because she said the right formula of words. Now, she probably did catch Jesus by surprise, but she found what she was seeking because she sought it in the right way, from the right posture. And all it was is she came to Jesus with humility. She approached Jesus not as someone who was owed something or deserved a healing, who deserved to be given something or to have her own personal wishes granted for her to have faith in Jesus. She came as an outsider who knew she was an outsider and who knew that any glimpse or soundbite of the story that she overheard, that any crumb of the good news that fell to her was a tremendous grace and was sufficient for all that she needed. And that's the point. It's also the point in which we enter the story. This unnamed woman's faith and the crumbs of the gospel that she gathers is the point at which we, Gentiles, those of us who are not Jewish, first enter the salvation story. Yes, we've heard the birth of Jesus in fulfillment of the prophecies, the flight to and from Egypt, and Jesus' emergence out of the waters of baptism that echoed the Exodus story. Jesus preaching the Sermon on the Mount in a way that ran parallel to Moses receiving the Holy Law on Mount Sinai. His Jewish method of storytelling that we call parables. And his healings that offered insight into Jewish purity customs and Sabbath observance. Jesus, his mission, his teaching, and his work were thoroughly Jewish. But here, a woman who has overheard the good news, a Canaanite woman, Israel's oldest and longest standing enemy, she's overheard the good news and knows she needs it for her life. She comes not seeking to replace anyone who's seated at the table or seeking a place of prominence or dominance, but she finds a possibility for all of us to enter the story of the creation and the recreation of the world and the peaceful, abundant reign of God by asking for crumbs. The gospel isn't ours. It's not something we have privileged access to. And if all we get is a crumb is enough. Now, this passage is the precursor to later in Matthew, the call to go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations. Jesus came and fulfilled God's promise to Israel, and that Jesus did this was good news for Israel and the rest of the world. Through Israel, God will bless the rest of the world. We, as Gentiles, have been adopted into that promise. We might be tempted to hear the call to take the good news to the nations as something that we possess and have to hand to other people. But before it was ever something for us to share with others, the good news is something that was shared with us. In the call to go take the gospel to the nations, we are the nations. And you know, when we take communion together as a church, you really only get a crumb of bread and a sip of wine. And that's not because of any budget constraints or issues of practicality. It's because a crumb of the body of Christ and a sip of the blood of the new covenant is enough to be fully drawn in. We have been grafted into a story and a promise that wasn't ours to start with, and that we don't have a right to claim as our own. And we weren't grafted in because we deserved it or because we corrected Jesus, not because we reminded Jesus that we needed it, but purely out of grace, as a pure gift. So where do we go from here? One step is to continue learning about and appreciating the Jewishness of Jesus, how not taking it seriously has had some negative consequences in history, but how also taking Jesus' Jewishness more seriously may positively impact how we approach our faith and how we practice our faith. This is the other reason I brought up the work of Amy Jill Levine, because you actually have a chance to put a face to a name this time. She will be giving this year's Perkins Lecture at the University of Evansville, an event being held on April 9th, and to which the public is invited. Her lecture is going to be titled, "Of Pearls and Prodigals, Hearing Jesus' Parables as Jewish Stories." So that might be one step. Another is to remind ourselves and to keep reminding ourselves and each other as we seek to share the good news with a culture and a community around us that is becoming more and more diverse, with people who we may be tempted to call outsiders, that we were outsiders too. So maybe the best way to approach this work is from humility, yet still knowing that there are enough crumbs to go around. Amen.